Now this ties in very much with the related question of theodicy. Those of you who've looked at Christian theology will know that this means the complex of problems relating to the existence of evil in the world. One of the biggest dilemmas for theistic theology, and recently reintroduced to me by my 4-year-old daughter when she came in from the garden with a sad expression on her face and said, "Daddy, why did God create stinging nettles?" And I didn't have an answer for her. And you have to be a good deal older than 4 before you can even begin to understand the variant responses that the theistic religions have given to this difficult problem. The Mu'tazilites insisted that good and evil are intrinsic properties, and that when human beings work evil or bring about evil in the world, it is not ultimately God that can be blamed for that. Whereas the Ash'aris believed that there is no intrinsic reality to good and evil. This is another of the classic propositions of Muslim theology. According to the Ash'aris, good actions are good only because God himself considers them to be good. And this position foreshadows, I think, some debates in modern Christian theology, such as you'll find discussed in the book by Alistair MacIntyre called Beyond Virtue. The great question of whether something is good because it's good in perhaps some philosophically unframeable, absolute way, or because God has made it good. Is there some reality to good and evil in the world? Fundamental ethical argument. The Mu'tazilites said the perfection of God demands that he do things that are truly good, not good simply because he does them. Similarly, God commands mankind to things that are authentic and are not just some kind of conventional virtue. Good and evil, the Mu'tazilites thought, can be established on purely rational grounds, and God is bound to act in accordance with that system of values. So they said that the Quran condemns female infanticide not to establish the principle that female infanticide is wrong, but in conformity with an absolute principle that the thing is wrong. So on the basis of this understanding, the Mu'tazilites quite simply limited God. They said that he was constrained by an axiology, by a system of values that was beyond him, that transcended him. They said, in short, that his omnipotence, his qudra, did not include the ability to will what is evil. That would entail some kind of futility, what they called abath, on his part. And it would invite, of course, the conclusion that he himself is evil. So God must consistently will the good. He cannot will man to sin, nor can he withhold guidance. If people go astray, that's always their choice, and God can't be blamed. And so concerned were they with this, with upholding this principle of the divine justice, that they even developed a further thesis which said that every suffering in the world has to receive a due compensation. So if you stumble over a stone in this world, God will recompense you for it, either later in this life or in the next life. So we find most of the Mu'tazilites even saying that animals will go to heaven, which orthodoxy has not accepted, because animals can suffer in this world. God, out of his justice, cannot allow that to be the end of the story, therefore he will give them pleasure in the next world to compensate for what they've suffered. The Orthodox, of course, never went along with this. While kindness to animals is very much part of the Muslim ethical package, Orthodox Islam has assumed that animals, because they don't have the ability to choose between good and evil, cannot be resurrected to face judgment. So we have this characteristic Mu'tazilite doctrine, which you'll still find taught in some of the theological colleges in Shia parts of the world, such as Iran, for instance, which is that God must act to secure the best interests of his creation. Inna Allah yajibu alayhi ri'ayatul aslah in Arabic. Now, to the Ash'aris, this seemed to encapsulate everything that was wrong with a certain type of over-rational Mu'tazilite mentality. It imposes a compulsion upon God, and such apparent compulsions are simply the inventions of limited human intellects, which God himself has created and which simply are not qualified to rise sufficiently high to decide on what is or is not possible for God. Now, the classical argument which the Ash'aris deploy is called the story of the three brothers. This is a story of three imaginary brothers, and we're told that one of them was good, one of them was wicked, and the third of them died as a child. So the first is in paradise, the second is in hell, and the third is in a limbo where he experiences neither reward nor punishment. Now, the third in the next life explains to God that he'd never been given a chance to obey God and hence merit paradise. So he complains to God for having made him die before he had a chance to work for heaven. Because the laws of Islam and the moral law obviously does not apply to children as it does to adults. And the reply is that God made him die young because he knew that if he grew up to maturity, he would actually be a sinner and hence merit hell. The Mu'tazilites could see the reason behind that. And then the second brother speaks up and asks why he had not been made to die young as well, so that he would be spared hell. And of course the Mu'tazilites on their system had no answer to this second question. And this story becomes the classical Ash'ari orthodox refutation of Mu'tazili rationalism. The idea being that by attempting to impose these limits on God's action and imposing human categories of good and evil on God, one ends up simply in absurd paradoxes of this kind. The later writers on heresy cite this story as the reason for the conversion of al-Ash'ari himself. He had been a Mu'tazilite in the southern Iraqi city of Basra and then converted to Ash'arism, according to the story, because the Prophet had appeared to him in a dream and urged him neither to accept the simple textual scriptural literalism of many of the hadith scholars and the Hanbalis, one extreme, nor to go to the other extreme and become lost in this kind of rationalistic speculation. And so Ash'ari himself charts a kind of median position between these two that is scripturally sensitive, but also includes rationalistic possibilities. And certainly in developed Ash'ari thought, we find the considerable importation of Greek categories, and particularly the use of Greek logic in Islamic theology. So Ash'ari theology, Muslim Orthodox theology that is essentially a kind of median or compromise position between strict scriptural literalism on the one hand and freewheeling rationalism on the other. The great period of Ash'ari orthodoxy was really the 12th and the 13th century. It took some time for this tradition to evolve. Its classical exponent is a truly brilliant mind called Al-Shahrastani. Shahrastani wrote a book called Nihayat al-Iqdam, which is translated as the Summa Philosophiae. There's an English translation of it if you want to look at it. And books like Shahrastani's are still the standard set texts for Muslim theology in the great Sunni universities. Now, in Shahrastani's developed position, we find the final and definitive orthodox Sunni repudiation of the Mu'tazilite ethical system. To support the Ash'arite denial of the intrinsic nature of good and evil, Shahrastani conjures up a kind of thought picture which later becomes fairly standard in the literature. He asks us to imagine a man who is born fully competent to understand and to reason. He's intelligent, but is brought up in some remote place, desert island for instance, and has absolutely no ethical training of any kind, no moral education. Such a person obviously will be enabled, as he grows up, to see the truth of, say, mathematical propositions, but he will have no verdict to give on the judgment that murder is wrong, for instance, or that God is bound to condemn it. He simply won't have been trained into that view. So for Shahrastani, there is no analogy between theoretical and moral propositions. This desert island person, if he witnesses a murder, will certainly understand the mechanical medical processes by which the victim dies, but he'll have no knowledge of whether the thing is actually good or bad. So these moral concepts for Shahrastani do not form part of the essential attributes of the event. But for God, according to the Ash'aris, murder would simply be morally neutral. So in this sense, you can say that God wills everything in the world without ever willing something that is evil. This is the crux of the argument. What he wills is by definition good, since the only coherent, non-subjective definition of what is good is what God does. So you can no more say that God wills evil than you can say that the rays of the sun are dark. It's simply what philosophers would call a category mistake. By definition, he cannot do what is evil. So evil in the world is ultimately not a reality, but simply an illusion caused by necessarily inadequate human perception. There are a number of other arguments here in the theology which I'll have to, as I say, skate over. Another one which I won't attempt to explain in detail, but just briefly outline, is the key Asharite doctrine of kasb. Again, the subject of some very brilliant medieval expositions. Kasb means literally acquisition. And this was a device which the Asharis employed in order to deal with the problem of theodicy, how God can apparently judge people for evil actions when he is himself the omnipotent creator of all actions. The Asharis very briefly distinguish between God's creation of acts on the one hand and man's acquisition of acts on the other. They thought there was a kind of almost instantaneous bubble, almost of free will, around the human soul at the moment that a human being acts, and that is sufficient grounds for God to reward or to condemn us. And it's such a subtle doctrine that, in fact, there's an Arabic proverb now. If something is really complicated, you say it's more subtle than the kasb of al-Ash'ari. But those of you who are interested in following the rigorous arguments through to the conclusions, I can give you references in modern studies of Muslim philosophical theology. And the difficulty of this doctrine, in fact, encouraged many later Muslim thinkers to view the whole question of predestination versus free will as actually something that cannot be adequately framed within the categories and the concepts of formal theology. And increasingly in Islamic thought, we find it being dealt with by mystics rather than by theologians. I mentioned earlier that in Christianity, formal theology has traditionally been central, mysticism something marginal, even sometimes questionable, whereas in Islam, the reverse has been the case. And we find in this case that the medieval doctrine of kasb was accepted by the consensus of medieval Muslim intellectuals. But the more satisfying resolution of this paradox was attempted by the mystical thinkers. So we find Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, affirming acquisitionist theology as being part and parcel of the formal creed, but he suggests a further level of truth. He says man is made in God's image, as a famous hadith records. And this recalls the Quranic statement that God himself has blown something of his spirit, his ruh, into Adam, the primordial type of humanity. Which means that man, as a theomorphic being, partakes, obviously in a contingent way, in all of the divine attributes. And this includes the attribute of will. So just as God is the compassionate, human beings can be compassionate as well, in a contingent way. God is the just, human beings can be just. God is the strong, human beings can be strong. All of the 99 names can have a human application. Similarly, God is al-Murid, he is the one who has volition, who has will. And human beings also, in a contingent way, can participate in this. And it is this participation, Ghazali thought, that contains the solution to this paradox. Ghazali says that moral decisions located in the conscience, the self-aware core of the human creature, are not located in the mind, as the theologians supposed, but in the ruh, this divine spark within man, this kind of spark which is separated in a ultimately illusory fashion from the divine fire, as the mystics saw it. And Ghazali says, وَأَمَّا سِرُّ الْقَدَرِ فَهُوَ الَّذِي تَحَيَّرَ فِيهِ الْأَكْثَرُونَ. As for the secrets of God's decree, this is the subject which has bewildered most of humanity. وَمُنِعَ مِنْ إِفْشَاءِ سِرِّهِ الْمُكَاشَفُونَ. And those who have been given mystical insights and illumination by God are prohibited from disclosing it. The secret seems to be, inasmuch as we can frame it, that when man truly becomes God's deputy on earth, we see that the separation of man's will from the will of God is, like all other separations, merely an illusion. So that's a case study of how theological questions ultimately ended up moving into a mystical register, which is quite a common feature of Muslim intellectual history. And the final satisfying solution that Muslims found was in the realm of mysticism.